So we're going to go ahead and talk about test design. And first we'll begin by talking about the value of testing. There's a concept that's called the testing effect, and I want to share with you some research that kind of makes that concept come alive for you. So Radiger and Karpik are kind of leaders in this area, and they've done a study that now has become, kind of quite a classic, and has been really consistently repeated, this finding by several other researchers as well. But let me go ahead and explain to you what they did in this particular study. They asked students to learn a set of, content, and students were randomly assigned to one of three groups. So first you see down here, this first group was asked to study the material 4 times. So study, 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 study. The next group was asked to study the material 3 times and then try to recall everything they could about that content. And then the very last group was asked to study the material only once, and then they had to test themselves 3 times. And in this particular study, there really was no feedback given about their performance on those tests either, although there are other studies that do speak to the feedback between testing really being valuable. And then you can see the dependent variable was how well did they retain that information. Well, what you can see here is an overview of the findings. So if we look at the immediate, what happens is the study group is the one who performed the best. But this was at 5 minutes later. What we're much more interested in is, can they hold on to that content for a long time? So when we look at a week, 10 days, 12 days later, it was an exact opposite kind of experience. And the study group actually performed the worst. So the group that performed the best was the study test group. And what this research highlighted was that testing wasn't just a way to show what you know, but it was a way to learn. It's a memory tool. So the more you test yourself, that act of practicing, retrieving that content from your mind is a way that really helps solidify the memory and helps you hold on to and retain that information. And that's why it's called the testing effect. So testing is a learning strategy, really, really valuable. Just a couple of other research studies on the power of testing and quizzing. So Landrum did a study that showed that if students took weekly quizzes, they performed much better on the cumulative final exam. And you can also see that some of the other researchers cited here looked at studies that showed that if you are given multiple opportunities to test, you again are going to increase your learning potential and achieve at higher levels. So basically, this research all speaks to the fact that testing is a very powerful tool. Now, some students really are not big fans of the pop quiz, although the pop quiz is a great way to hold students accountable for the material outside of class and to keep them on their toes and to get them engaged in that practice retrieval. But as you know, students don't really like it so much. They actually, many of them hate it very much. So many faculty are kind of hesitant to engage in the pop quiz. When I came across this study by Ruscio, I was quite interested in it because basically what Ruscio did is he flipped a coin at the beginning of class and he told his students that if it came out heads, they were going to take a quiz, and if it came out tails, they weren't. And surprisingly, his students were totally cooperative and, on board with this plan. And when you think about it, it makes sense because it seems very fair to them. It wasn't a gotcha. And I think many students have had in their experience that the pop quiz was a gotcha. When the faculty member felt like students didn't read, we're going to do a pop quiz, almost in a punitive way. And this way that Ruscio used it was not in a punitive way. So the point here is you want to think about how you can integrate quizzing into your courses, because it's a great way to help that testing effect kind of, be put into action. And also it really helps students monitor their progress towards their academic goals. Cumulative finals are a really powerful strategy as well. And you can see here in this study by Lawrence that this first column is students who were in the cumulative final exam section, and these students did not have the cumulative final. And it didn't really matter whether they were low scores or high scores on the exam. The overall final grades for students in the cumulative was much higher than those in the non-cumulative. So basically, students learn more when they do have that cumulative final opportunity. So it is important to also include that in your classes. All right, so now that we talked about the importance of testing and why it matters, let's talk about how do we design effective tests. We're going to talk about 3 different issues: first multiple choice, then short answer and essays, and then finally we'll just spend a little bit of time on online exams. So let's start off by focusing on how important it is that you choose the format based on what your learning outcomes are. So if you're, down at the bottom and you're doing remembering, you're probably not going to need an essay question to do remembering. You probably can accomplish that with a pretty straightforward multiple choice test. Whereas if you're doing, creating or evaluating, it's possible to move up the chain and use a multiple choice test with some of these higher level cognitive skills, but it is much more challenging to do so. So you might want to shift over to the essay type format. So again, you want to keep learning outcomes in mind as you decide which format is going to work best. So let's focus first on multiple choice exams, and the first part that we'll turn our attention to is the question stem. So again, you want to make sure that the questions are all linked to your learning outcomes, and they should be meaningful. We want to try to keep them clear, focused, and straightforward. We're not out to create tricky questions and confuse students. So it's really important that we avoid any distracting or irrelevant information and kind of keep it focused on whatever the task is. Again, you can, do a basic pure memory type, low-level Bloom question, or it can be more complex and be applied or evaluative. But again, you still don't want to get it so convoluted and complicated that you're not really testing what you're hoping to test. It is also a good idea to try to avoid the negative language. That double negatives, really can be more confusing, and just it puts students in a position that is not really a test of what they're knowing about that subject, but really more how well they can differentiate the, convoluted language that you've put up in front of them. Okay, the other thing I want to focus on is answer options, and I came across some pretty robust research in this area that I don't think many folks are aware of, and you honestly only need to have 3 answer options. So there are several studies out there, including this one by Rodriguez, which was a meta-analysis, as you can see, that looked at over 27 studies over a period of 80 years. And what they found was that 3 answer options seem to have, just as strong reliability and validity as having 4 or 5. So this is a blessing, because if you've ever tried to create a multiple choice question and come up with alternatives, sometimes you're racking your brain trying to come up with that 4th option, and this research really lets you off the hook. You don't need to worry about that so much. In fact, what some of the researchers point out is if you don't have as many answer options, you can then increase the number of questions that you're asking, and then you're actually testing them on more content, because the time that they need to read all those answer choices is eating up a lot of the test time, whereas you could push that into a new question. So it is a really great strategy to just have 3 answer options. Now, still speaking about answer options, you want to make sure, again, these are also simple and straightforward. You want to make sure they're mutually exclusive, so it's not like, they're mixing and mingling too. All of them should be plausible. I mean, it's really silly to put in an option that makes no sense at all. Everyone will be able to, eliminate that option, and you really haven't accomplished anything with that. You want to make sure the grammar is consistent with the stems, so make sure they all kind of flow well. And using all of the above and none of the above often isn't a great idea. Whenever possible, try to just give different alternatives for students to choose from. All right, so how long should an exam be? A lot of times faculty are like, I'm not sure how many questions I should use. Well, some of that has to do with how much time you're going to give them. There's a very general rule of thumb kind of indicated here at 1 minute per multiple choice, 2 minutes for very short answers, 10 to 15 minutes for essays, or 30 to 60 minutes for a really long essay. But the truth of the matter is that there really is no absolute answer here, because it depends on the complexity of the question. So if you're asking a multiple choice question that's a high cognitive, question, that's going to take more mental energy and more time for students to process and think about. Whereas if you're asking them a very straightforward definition or something, that's going to be very quick. They probably don't need a full minute for that. 20 seconds or even 30 might be more than plenty. So, there really are some just general rules of thumb, but you have to kind of know in terms of what your content is and the complexity of the questions that you're asking. All right, so now we'll turn our attention to short answer and essay questions. So again, just like with the multiple choice, we want to make sure they're directly linked to our learning outcomes and that they're meaningful. The questions, again, need to be straightforward and clear. We're trying to avoid the confusing language, and we want to also think about, different things we want to do. So first of all, what format are you asking students? Does it need to be in paragraph form, or are you really looking for content only, and they could maybe create a table or a concept map or bullets? And then also you want to think about, Do you want students to answer all the questions? Do you want them to have any choice in the matter? Maybe you have 5 and they get to pick 4. There are some concerns about that because then you might be missing one of your learning outcomes. So if you are going to give them choices, you do want to make sure that you're giving them choices within learning outcomes. So for instance, maybe learning outcome 1 has 2 essay questions and they can choose one of them. And learning outcome 2 is 2 essay questions and they can choose one of them. You don't want to eliminate any of the key content because you do want to assess them on all of your learning outcomes. If you do use short answer essay questions, you're most certainly going to want to create a rubric for grading purposes. That's really going to help your grading process, make it much more streamlined, and again, you'll be much more fair and consistent. So some other considerations with the short answer and essay is length of time that you need to complete, for students to complete it. You want to be mindful of the fact, especially if you're going to have them handwriting, if they're not in a place where they have access to computer labs, you don't want to tax the hands and make them work too hard. So you do want to keep it into a manageable number of questions. And likewise, you also don't want to have, 1,000 questions to have to grade as well. So sometimes a mixed methods approach really works well, where you're getting some multiple choice and then a couple of short answers. But again, it really depends on the nature of your discipline and the content that you're assessing. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about is online exams. And, obviously the online exam, provides you with an opportunity to test students but not have to use your class time, which is a very big bonus. But you need to think about several different things. Are you going to ask students to take an open book test, or is it going to be closed book? Now, if it's closed book, then you need to worry about setting parameters to try to, limit the temptation for students to engage in dishonest actions. So things such as putting timetables on it, and that's when you need to kind of know, well, now am I giving them 30 seconds for multiple choice? Am I giving them a minute for that? How many minutes am I giving them for the short answer? And again, that becomes a little tricky because you have to think about the nature of your question. You also have parameters where you can randomize the answers. You can also have a pool of questions so that every student's getting different questions. Again, you do want to make sure those questions are all aligned to your learning outcomes and you're not missing any key content if you use that approach. The other thing that you can think about is, should I let students have more than one attempt? The online version really is a great way for them to have multiple opportunities to learn from the testing process. So really think about that. Maybe you can give them 2 or 3 attempts, and maybe the best score counts, or an average of the scores count, whatever it is that you think will work best for them. One of the advantages is that students get immediate feedback if it's an objective test, such as multiple choice. Obviously, if it's an essay that needs to be graded by the faculty member, that doesn't happen in an immediate fashion. But students really value that immediate prompt feedback. So I hope that these strategies are helpful to you, and that you find the additional readings to be helpful, as well as you think about how you can design an effective test.